People don't notice kindness when it's quiet, until it changes everything. The rain had been falling for hours, the kind that soaked through fabric and settled into your bones, and I could feel it seeping through the thin soles of my worn-out sneakers as I stood near the back gate of the estate, waiting for my shift to end. Counting the minutes the way I always did when my feet started to ache and my stomach reminded me I'd skipped dinner again. The Romano estate didn't look like a place where people like me belonged. All marble pillars and perfectly trimmed hedges, stretching across acres of land that probably cost more than I could earn in a lifetime. But my mom worked there, cleaning rooms no one ever used, polishing surfaces no one ever touched, and I followed her path because sometimes survival doesn't give you choices. It just gives you directions. I was about to clock out when I saw him, an old man standing just outside the iron gates, his coat too thin for the cold, his shoulders slightly hunched like the world had been pressing down on him for too long, and the security guard barely gave him a second glance before stepping forward and waving him away with the kind of dismissive gesture I'd seen too many times, like the man wasn't even worth a full sentence. "Move along," the guard muttered, already turning back toward the warmth inside, but the old man didn't argue, didn't beg. He just nodded once, quiet, almost invisible, and something about that, about how easily he accepted being unseen, made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't ignore. I told myself to keep walking, to mind my own business like everyone else did, because that's how you kept your job here, how you stayed under the radar, how you didn't get noticed in the wrong way. But my feet didn't listen. They slowed, then stopped. And before I could talk myself out of it, I turned back. "Hey," I called softly, my voice barely carrying over the rain, and he looked up, surprised, like he hadn't expected anyone to speak to him at all. His eyes tired but sharp in a way that didn't match the rest of him. I hesitated for half a second, then reached into my bag, pulling out the sandwich I'd saved for later, the one thing I'd been looking forward to after a long shift, and held it out to him, my hand trembling just slightly as the rain tapped against my skin. "You should eat something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, like this wasn't a risk. Like I wasn't fully aware of the cameras above the gate or the rules I was quietly breaking. He stared at the sandwich for a moment, then at me, as if trying to understand why I was doing this at all, and when he finally took it, his fingers brushed mine. Cold, rough, real, and he gave a small nod, the kind that said more than words ever could. "You shouldn't be out here," I added, glancing toward the estate behind me, its lights glowing warm and distant, a different world entirely. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it, just something deeper, something older, and said, "Neither should you." I didn't know why that stayed with me, why those simple words settled somewhere beneath my ribs, but I felt it, the shift, small but undeniable, like something had just begun and I hadn't even realized I'd stepped into it yet. I should have walked away after that, should have gone back inside and pretended none of it happened, because that is how people like me survive in places like that, by staying invisible, by not getting involved. But I lingered near the gate longer than I should have, watching him from the corner of my eye as he sat on the low concrete ledge just outside the estate, unwrapping the sandwich slowly like it was something rare instead of something simple and ordinary. The rain softened into a drizzle, and for a moment, everything felt quieter, like the world had taken a breath, and I realized I was still standing there, still watching, still thinking about the way he had looked at me, not with gratitude exactly, but with something steadier. Something that made me feel seen in a way I was not used to. "You're going to get in trouble," he said without looking up, his voice calm, almost certain, and I let out a small breath, shifting my weight on tired feet. "Probably," I admitted, pulling my jacket tighter around me, but it would not be the first time, and that made him glance up, really. "Look at me this time," his eyes sharper than they had any right to be. "You work here," he said, not a question, and I nodded, brushing damp hair away from my face. "My mom does too," I added, not sure why I felt the need to explain. "Cleaning mostly. I help when I can," and he studied me for a second longer, like he was putting pieces together that I did not even know were there. "And they treat you well?" he asked, and something in the way he said it made the answer catch in my throat, because the truth was complicated, because being tolerated was not the same as being treated well, because surviving was not the same as living, but I shrugged instead, forcing a small smile that I had practiced too many times. "It is a job," I said simply. And he nodded like he understood more than I had said. A car passed by on the street, headlights cutting briefly across the gates, and for a second, I saw him more clearly, the lines on his face, the way he held himself, not weak like I had first assumed, but controlled, like someone who had chosen to stand in the cold rather than been forced into it. "You should not be out here long," I said, glancing toward the security cameras again, my heartbeat picking up as I remembered where I was, who might be watching, what it could cost me. He folded the sandwich wrapper carefully, almost neatly, and set it beside him before looking back at me. "You worry about consequences," he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, just observation. "But you still came back, and I did not know how to answer that, because I was not sure myself, because something about leaving him there had felt worse than any warning I could get. The sound of footsteps behind me made my stomach drop, sharp and immediate. And I turned just in time to see the head of security stepping out from the side entrance, his expression already tightening as his eyes moved from me to the man outside the gate. "Emily," he called, his voice carrying that controlled edge. That meant trouble. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" And just like that, the quiet moment shattered, reality snapping back into place as I felt the weight of the estate, the rules, the invisible lines I had just crossed pressing down on me all at once. The air shifted the moment he said my name, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees without warning, and I felt it in my chest before I even turned fully around, that tight, familiar pressure that came with knowing I had stepped out of line. "I was just leaving," I said quickly, my voice steady on the surface, but thinner than I wanted it to be, and I could feel the security chief's eyes on me, sharp and measuring, the kind of look that did not miss anything and did not forgive much either. "You were instructed not to interact with anyone outside the estate," he replied, his tone controlled, professional, but underneath it there was something colder, something that made my fingers curl slightly at my sides as if bracing for impact. I nodded, because arguing would only make it worse, because I had learned a long time ago that explanations did not change outcomes in places like this. They just delayed them. "It will not happen again," I said, keeping my gaze level even. Though every instinct told me to look down, to shrink, to disappear, and for a second, there was silence, the kind that stretched just long enough to make your heart beat louder in your ears. "See that it does not," he said finally, before turning his attention past me, toward the man still sitting outside the gate, and his expression shifted, not softer, but dismissive in a way that felt heavier somehow, like the man was not even worth a full reaction. "You need to move along," he added, more sharply this time, and I glanced back without thinking, just for a second, long enough to see the old man rise slowly to his feet, brushing rain from his coat with a calmness that did not match the situation, his movements steady, deliberate, like he was choosing each one instead of being pushed into it. Our eyes met again, and there was something there, something unspoken, something that made my breath catch before I could stop it. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but it felt heavier than it should have, like a quiet acknowledgment that this moment mattered in ways I did not yet understand. I turned back quickly, forcing myself to walk toward the staff entrance, each step feeling louder than it should have on the wet pavement, my mind already racing ahead to the consequences, to the possibility of being written up, or worse, of my mother being affected because of me. Because nothing here ever stayed contained to just one person. Inside, the warmth hit me immediately, along with the familiar scent of polished wood and expensive candles, a world so carefully maintained that it almost felt unreal, and I moved through it automatically, past rooms that looked untouched, past people who barely noticed me, slipping back into the rhythm I knew so well. But it was different now. Something small but undeniable had shifted. Like a thread had been pulled loose, and I could not quite find where it ended. "Emily," my mother's voice called softly from down the hall, and I turned toward it, already preparing to act normal, to smooth everything over, to pretend nothing had happened. But the moment I stepped into the service corridor and saw the concern in her eyes, I realized that something had already changed, whether I was ready for it or not, because moments like that, quiet and unnoticed by everyone else, had a way of becoming something bigger. Something that did not stay small for long. My mother did not ask questions right away, and that was how I knew she already understood more than I had said, because she had spent years reading the spaces between my words, the small shifts in my expression, the things I tried to hide so she would not worry. What happened? She asked quietly once we were alone in the narrow service hallway, her voice low enough that it would not carry beyond the metal doors and supply carts, and I forced a small shrug, setting my bag down like it weighed. Nothing, even though my shoulders ached from the long shift. Nothing, I said, too quickly, and her eyes softened in that way that meant she did not believe me, but was giving me the chance to tell the truth anyway. Emily, she said, just my name. But it held enough weight to make me exhale slowly, the tension slipping out before I could stop it. There was a man outside the gate, I admitted, keeping my voice just above a whisper. He looked like he needed help, so I gave him my sandwich, and even as I said it, it sounded small, insignificant, like something that should not matter at all, but her expression changed immediately, concern sharpening into something closer to fear. You cannot do that here, she said, not harshly, but firmly, like she was trying to protect me from something I could not fully see. People are always watching, and they do not like it when we step outside our place, and I nodded, because I knew that, because I had lived that reality for as long as I could remember. But the memory of the old man sitting in the rain, of the way he had accepted being ignored, lingered stubbornly in my mind. He was just alone, I said, the words coming out softer than I intended. And she reached for my hand, squeezing it gently, her grip warm and grounding. Kindness is not wrong, she said, her voice quieter now, almost careful, but where you give it can change everything, and that settled somewhere deep in my chest, heavy and unresolved. The rest of the night passed in a blur of routine, folding linens, wiping surfaces that already gleamed, moving through rooms that felt more like displays than places people actually lived. And I did what I always did, kept my head down, stayed quiet. Finished my tasks without drawing attention, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the gate, to the moment our eyes met, to the strange feeling that I had crossed an invisible line I could not step back over. By the time my shift ended, the rain had stopped completely, leaving the air cool and still, and as I stepped outside, I found myself glancing toward the gate again without meaning to, half expecting to see him there, sitting in the same spot, like nothing had changed, but the space was empty. The concrete ledge bare, as if he had never been there at all. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, the quiet stretching around me, and I told myself that was it, that it had been a small moment, already over, already fading. But something in my chest disagreed, something subtle and persistent, like a thread being pulled tighter instead of loosening. I turned to leave, adjusting the strap of my bag over my shoulder, trying to push the feeling aside, to return to the familiar rhythm of getting through another day. But just before I reached the end of the driveway, I noticed something I had not seen before, a black car parked across the street, engine off, windows dark, sitting there like it had been waiting longer than it should have. And for a brief second, as I walked past, I had the strange, unshakable sense that I was not the only one who had not forgotten what happened at the gate. That car stayed in my mind longer than it should have, the way it had been parked just far enough from the estate to avoid attention, but close enough to see everything that came and went, and I told myself it was nothing. Just another expensive vehicle in a neighborhood full of them. But the feeling did not leave. It settled quietly under my skin, the same way the old man's words had. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. The faint gray light of early dawn slipping through the thin curtains of our small apartment, and for a moment I lay there listening to the hum of the city waking up, trying to convince myself that yesterday had been small, forgettable, something that would not follow me into today. But the truth was already there, waiting. Steady and patient. By the time I arrived at the estate, Everything looked exactly the same. The gates tall and unyielding, the driveway spotless, the staff already moving with quiet efficiency, and I almost laughed at myself for thinking anything could have changed overnight, because places like this did not change. They remained exactly as they were, no matter what happened at their edges. I kept my head down, moving through my tasks, folding linens, organizing supplies, staying within the invisible lines that had been drawn long before I ever stepped foot there. But there was a tension in the air I could not quite explain, something subtle, like a shift in the rhythm I had grown used to, and I noticed it in the way people spoke a little quieter, in the way the security staff moved a little more deliberately, like they were waiting for something they had not yet named. "Did you hear?" one of the housekeepers whispered as she passed me in the hallway, her voice barely above a breath. And I shook my head automatically, not wanting to draw attention, but she leaned closer anyway, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and caution. "There is someone important coming today," she said, the words carrying a weight that made my stomach tighten without warning, and I forced a small nod. Pretending it did not matter, pretending it was just another event, another arrival, another day that would pass like all the others. But it did not feel the same, and as the morning stretched on, that feeling only grew, quiet but insistent, like something unseen was moving closer. Around mid-morning, I was sent to the front corridor to assist with preparations, a task that usually meant staying out of sight while everything was arranged perfectly for whoever was expected. And as I stepped into the polished space, I noticed the difference immediately, the way the staff stood a little straighter, the way the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then I heard it, the low, synchronized sound of engines approaching from beyond the gates. Smooth and controlled, not loud but unmistakable, and my heart skipped before I could stop it, a sudden, sharp reaction that made no sense until I realized why. Until the memory of the black car from the night before surfaced in my mind with unsettling clarity. The gates opened slowly, almost ceremonially, and one by one a line of black vehicles rolled in, their surfaces gleaming under the morning light. Each movement precise, deliberate, like everything had been planned down to the smallest detail, and I found myself standing completely still, my breath shallow, my thoughts suddenly scattered, because something about this was different, something about this felt connected to a moment that should have been insignificant, but was not. As the first car came to a stop, the doors remained closed for a brief second, just long enough to stretch the silence, just long enough for anticipation to settle into something heavier, and without realizing it, I took a small step forward, drawn by something I could not name, something that felt like the beginning of an answer I had not known I was waiting for. The door opened with a quiet, deliberate click, and everything seemed to pause in that exact moment, like the entire estate had been waiting for it, like every breath had been held just a second too long. A man stepped out first, tall and composed, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit that fit him like it had been designed for him alone, his movements controlled, precise, and there was something about the way the others subtly shifted around him that made it clear he was not just important. He was the center of whatever this was. His gaze moved across the estate quickly, not rushed, but efficient, taking in everything without seeming to linger on anything, until it stopped, just for a fraction of a second, in my direction, and even though I knew he could not possibly know who I was, the weight of that glance settled into me like it did. Then the second door opened, slower this time, and my breath caught before I could stop it, because I recognized him instantly, not from where he was now, but from where he had been, standing in the rain, sitting on that cold concrete ledge, holding a simple sandwich like it mattered. He stepped out of the car with the same calm, steady movements, but everything else about him was different. The coat replaced with a dark, perfectly cut suit, the quiet invisibility gone, replaced with something undeniable, something that did not ask to be seen because it already was. For a second, my mind refused to connect the two images. The man from the gate and the man standing here now, surrounded by people who moved with quiet deference. But then he turned his head slightly, and our eyes met again, and this time there was no doubt, no confusion, just the clear, undeniable Recognition that hit me all at once. I felt it in my chest, sharp and sudden, the realization unfolding faster than I could process it, and, before I could look away, the man in the black suit stepped closer to him, his posture shifting in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, respect without hesitation, authority meeting something even higher. "Father," he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying enough weight to ripple through the silence around us, and just like that, everything rearranged itself in my mind, every detail snapping into place with a clarity that made my pulse quicken. The old man, no, not old in the way I had thought, not fragile or forgotten, but something else entirely, something hidden in plain sight, gave a small nod, acknowledging the word like it belonged to him in a way that nothing else did. I stood frozen where I was, the polished floor beneath my feet suddenly feeling less stable, my thoughts racing back to the night before, to the rain, to the gate, to the moment I had handed him the only food I had. Unaware of who he truly was, unaware of what that moment might mean. Around me, the staff had already adjusted, their posture straighter, their movements sharper, the entire atmosphere shifting to match the presence that had just arrived. But I could not move, could not pull myself out of that moment, because something inside me had already changed, something that could not go back to what it was before. The man, Alexander, I realized distantly, his name spoken in quiet whispers around the estate before, turned slightly, his gaze following his father's, and when his eyes found me again, there was a flicker of something there, brief but unmistakable. Something that felt like recognition even though we had never met, and in that instant, I understood one thing with absolute certainty, that the moment I thought had been small, quiet, invisible, had just become something else entirely, something that was no longer mine alone to forget. No one spoke for a moment after that word settled into the air, but everything changed anyway, not loudly, not dramatically, just in the way people shifted, the way their eyes lowered, the way the space itself seemed to rearrange around the two men standing at the center of it all, and I felt it from where I stood, like a quiet pressure building under my skin. I should have looked away, should have stepped back into the role I understood, invisible, unnoticed, but I could not move, not when his gaze lingered on me just a second longer than it should have, not when I knew, with a certainty that made my pulse quicken, that he remembered. The older man turned slightly, his posture relaxed, but intentional. And there was a faint curve at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but something close, something private, as if he was acknowledging a moment only the two of us shared. "Her," he said simply, his voice calm, steady, but carrying enough weight that it drew attention without effort, and I felt every pair of eyes in the corridor shift toward me all at once. My breath caught, my body going still in a way that felt almost instinctive, like I had been placed under a spotlight I had no control over. Alexander followed his father's gaze without hesitation, his expression unreadable, composed in a way that made it impossible to guess what he was thinking, but there was a sharpness in his eyes now, focused, deliberate, and when he took a step forward, the distance between us suddenly felt too small and too large at the same time. "You," he said, his voice lower than I expected, controlled but not cold, and I realized he was not asking a question. He was confirming something, placing me into a moment that had already been decided. I swallowed, forcing myself to straighten, to meet his gaze even though every instinct told me to look down, because something in me refused to disappear now, not after everything had already been seen. Yes, I managed, my voice steady enough to hold, though my hands felt colder than they should have, and there was a brief pause, the kind that stretched just enough to make every second feel longer than it was. The older man stepped forward then, closing the distance with an ease that felt deliberate, and when he stopped in front of me, I noticed again the details I had missed before. The quiet strength in the way he carried himself, the clarity in his eyes, the absence of anything fragile or uncertain. "You gave me your dinner," he said, not as a question, not even as a statement, but as Something closer to a memory being placed carefully between us, and I felt my chest tighten, the simplicity of that moment now standing in sharp contrast to everything around it. I did not think it mattered, I said softly. The truth slipping out before I could reshape it into something safer, and for the first time, he smiled fully, not wide, not exaggerated, but real in a way that made the space feel different. That is why it did, he replied, his voice quieter now, but somehow more present. And I felt something shift again, deeper this time, something that reached beyond the moment itself. Alexander's gaze moved between us, measuring, assessing, and there was a flicker of something there, something I could not name but could feel, like a decision forming behind his eyes. Around us, the estate remained perfectly still, the staff silent, waiting, watching, and I realized then that whatever happened next would not just be a passing moment, it would be something that carried weight. Something that would not fade as easily as I had hoped, because kindness, when seen by the wrong or the right person, had a way of changing everything. The silence did not break right away, it deepened, stretched, settled over everything like something deliberate, and I could feel it pressing in from all sides, the weight of attention, of expectation, of something unspoken that everyone else seemed to understand except me. Alexander did not move at first, his gaze still fixed on me, steady and unreadable, but there was a shift in the air around him, subtle but undeniable. Like a decision had already been made and the rest of the world was just catching up to it. "What is your name?" he asked finally, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying through the corridor without effort, and for a second I hesitated, not because I did not know the answer, but because saying it here, in this moment, felt like stepping into something I could not step back out of. "Emily," I said, my voice quieter than his, but steady enough to hold, and I watched as he nodded once, as if confirming something he had already suspected. His father stepped back slightly then, giving space without fully retreating, his presence still anchoring the moment in a way that made everything feel more real, more final. "Emily," Alexander repeated, testing the sound of it like it mattered, and I felt my pulse pick up again. Not from fear exactly, but from the strange certainty that this moment was changing something I could not yet see. His gaze shifted briefly to the staff around us, the silent line of people who had frozen in place, watching without appearing to watch, and something in his expression hardened just slightly, not in anger, but in clarity, like he was drawing a line that had not existed before. "Who supervises her?" he asked, not looking at anyone in particular. But the question landed instantly, pulling the head of security forward with a stiffness that had not been there before. "I do," the man replied, his voice respectful now in a way that felt different from before, more careful, more aware. Alexander studied him for a second, long enough to make the silence stretch again, and then his gaze returned to me, sharper this time, more focused. "She will not be reprimanded," he said, the words simple, direct, but carrying a finality that left no room for interpretation, and I felt something inside me shift again, something loosening, something I had not realized I had been holding on to. The head of security nodded immediately, stepping back without question. And around us, the tension changed, not gone, but redirected, like the current had been altered and everyone was adjusting to it in real time. I should have felt relief, should have let the moment pass, but instead I found myself standing there, caught between what I had known and what was unfolding now, because this was not just about avoiding trouble anymore. This was something else, something larger. Alexander's gaze softened just slightly as he looked at me again, not enough to lose its intensity, but enough to change its meaning, and when he spoke next, his voice was quieter, but somehow more present. "You showed kindness when it was not required," he said, each word measured, deliberate, and I felt them settle into me, heavier than they should have been. His father watched quietly, that same faint expression still there, like he was waiting to see how this would unfold. "That is remembered," Alexander added, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear this was not just a passing acknowledgement, not just a polite statement, but something that would carry forward, something that would not be forgotten. I did not know what to say, did not know how to respond to something like that, so I simply nodded. The only thing that felt real in a moment that had already moved beyond anything I had expected, and as he turned slightly, signaling the end of the exchange without dismissing it entirely, I realized with a quiet certainty that nothing about my place here was the same anymore, because being seen, truly seen, was not something you could undo once it had happened. The moment did not end with a grand gesture or a dramatic shift. It settled instead, quiet and steady, like something permanent had been placed beneath the surface of everything else, and I felt it as Alexander turned away, his attention already moving forward, his presence pulling the rest of the estate back into motion as if nothing had happened, except I knew that was not true, because something had happened, something that could not be undone. The staff resumed their roles almost immediately, voices low, movements precise, but there was a difference now, subtle but undeniable, in the way they glanced at me, in the way their expressions held just a fraction longer than before, like I had become something they did not fully understand but could not ignore. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, my hands still at my sides, my thoughts trying to catch up to everything that had just unfolded, and then I moved, because standing still was no longer an option. Because life here did not pause for anyone, not even for moments that changed everything. The rest of the day passed in a strange kind of clarity, each task sharper, each sound more defined, like I was seeing everything through a different lens, and I realized that nothing around me had actually changed. The same polished floors, the same quiet corridors, the same unspoken rules, but I had, and that difference was enough to make everything feel unfamiliar. When my shift finally ended, I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the sky painted in fading shades of orange and gray, and for a moment I just stood there, breathing it in, letting the quiet settle around me the way it had the night before, except this time it felt different. Less uncertain, more certain in a way I could not fully explain. I glanced toward the gate without thinking, the same place where everything had started, and it looked exactly as it always did, solid, unchanging. But I knew now that what happened beyond it did not stay beyond it, that lines could blur, that moments could cross over and follow you whether you wanted them to or not. Emily, my mother's voice called softly from behind me, and I turned, seeing her standing there with that same familiar concern, but now there was something else in her eyes too, something like cautious hope mixed with uncertainty. "Are you all right?" she asked, and I nodded slowly. Because I was, and I was not, because I felt steadier and more unsettled at the same time. "I think so," I said. And it was the truth, even if it was not complete. She studied me for a second longer, then gave a small nod, like she understood that some things did not need to be explained right away. We walked toward the exit together, side by side, the gravel crunching softly beneath our steps, and as we reached the gate, I paused for just a second, my hand brushing lightly against the cold metal, grounding myself in something familiar before stepping through. The street beyond looked the same as it always had, cars passing, lights flickering on as the evening settled in, but I knew, with a quiet certainty that settled deep in my chest, that I was not the same person who had walked out here the night before, because I had been seen, truly seen. And that kind of moment did not fade, it stayed. It echoed. It changed the way the world looked back at you, and as we walked away, I realized something I had not understood before, that kindness did not always come back in the way you expected. It did not always arrive loudly or immediately, but when it did, when it found its way back to you through paths you could not have predicted, it carried something more than reward. It carried recognition, and that, more than anything else, had the power to change everything.